Most people spend years trying to change their lives without ever realizing they may have been taught the wrong rules. We are told that life is a competition. Work harder, fight harder, worry more, prepare for the worst, expect disappointment. And somewhere along the way, many people begin believing that struggle itself is proof they are doing life correctly. But what if the problem isn't that you're weak, unlucky, or behind? What if you've simply been playing a game without understanding how the game actually works? Nearly 100 years ago, Florence Scovel Shinn wrote a small book called The Game of Life and How to Play It. Her ideas have survived generations because they speak to something timeless inside human beings. This is not about magic. This is not about pretending pain doesn't exist. It is about understanding the invisible habits, beliefs, fears, and expectations that quietly shape the direction of our lives. Because whether we realize it or not, every person is playing a game. The only question is whether we understand the rules. And sometimes, the greatest transformation begins when we stop fighting life and start understanding it. Most people believe their problems begin outside themselves. They blame the economy, their childhood, bad bosses, failed relationships, bad timing, or simple bad luck. And while many of those things are real, there is another force that often goes unnoticed: the stories we tell ourselves. Human beings are constantly creating meaning. Every disappointment becomes evidence of something. A failed relationship becomes proof that nobody can be trusted. Losing a job becomes proof that success belongs to other people. One mistake becomes proof that we are not good enough. Over time, these stories become identities, and identities begin producing predictable outcomes. Imagine two people facing the exact same setback. One person says, "This always happens to me. My life never works out." The other says, "This hurts, but this chapter is not my entire story." Both people experienced pain, but their futures immediately begin moving in different directions. Florence Scovel Shinn believed that life responds to what we consistently expect, believe, and emotionally rehearse. Modern psychology shows something similar. The mind naturally searches for evidence that supports our beliefs. If we believe we are failures, we unconsciously notice failures. If we believe we are forgotten, we notice rejection everywhere. If we believe nothing good is coming, we become blind to opportunities standing directly in front of us. Many people are not imprisoned by circumstances. They are imprisoned by conclusions they made years ago. Perhaps someone betrayed them once, so they stopped trusting forever. Perhaps they failed publicly, so they stopped trying privately. Perhaps they grew up hearing criticism and eventually adopted that voice as their own. And without realizing it, they began participating in their own limitations. This does not mean positive thinking solves everything. Life can be painful. People can disappoint us. Dreams can collapse. But suffering and hopelessness are not the same thing. Pain is something we experience. Hopelessness is a story we tell ourselves about what pain means. That difference changes everything. Some of the strongest people you admire are not people who avoided hardship. They are people who refused to let hardship define their identity. They suffered without surrendering their future. They lost without declaring themselves losers. They cried without abandoning hope. And perhaps that is one of the first rules of life. Events matter. But the meaning we assign to those events often matters even more. Because long before circumstances change, the story inside us usually changes first. One of the greatest misunderstandings people have about life is believing that receiving comes before giving. We live in a world that teaches us to ask, "What can I get?" More money, more recognition, more security, more attention, more love. But Florence Scovel Shinn observed something that many successful and fulfilled people eventually discover for themselves. Life often operates in the opposite direction. What we consistently give has a strange way of returning to us, though not always in the form we expect. This does not mean becoming a doormat or sacrificing yourself for people who continually take advantage of your kindness. Instead, it means understanding that generosity, encouragement, integrity, gratitude, and service are not weaknesses. They are investments. Consider the people who leave lasting impressions on us. Rarely are they remembered because they possess the most money or the most power. They are remembered because they made people feel seen. They offered hope when others offered criticism. They listened when everyone else was distracted. They brought calm into chaotic situations. In many ways, human beings become wealthy long before money arrives. They become wealthy in trust, relationships, reputation, and peace of mind. And those invisible forms of wealth often create the foundation for visible success later. Modern society celebrates transactions, but human beings still crave connection. A person may accumulate impressive achievements and still feel completely alone. Another person may possess very little and yet be surrounded by love, loyalty, and meaningful relationships. This is why some people reach the top only to discover they climbed the wrong mountain. They spent years chasing external victories while neglecting the things that make life worth living. Perhaps the greatest example of this principle appears in ordinary people whose sacrifices often go unnoticed. Parents who work exhausting hours to create opportunities for their children. Friends who quietly remain present during difficult seasons. Teachers who encourage students who no longer believe in themselves. Partners who stay loyal when life becomes complicated. These acts rarely make headlines, but they shape lives in ways that statistics cannot measure. Giving is not always about money. Sometimes giving means patience. Sometimes it means forgiveness. Sometimes it means encouragement. Sometimes it means simply refusing to become bitter after life has wounded you. Ironically, bitterness often feels powerful in the beginning but becomes heavy over time. Forgiveness feels difficult in the beginning but becomes lighter over time. And perhaps this is another rule of life. The things we repeatedly release into the world eventually influence the atmosphere we ourselves must live inside. Which means every day, whether consciously or unconsciously, we are planting seeds. And sooner or later, every seed produces something. Fear rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it enters quietly. It disguises itself as caution, realism, or responsibility. It whispers that now is not the right time. It tells us to wait until we feel more confident, more prepared, or more certain. And because fear often sounds reasonable, many people never recognize how much control it has over their lives. They believe they are protecting themselves, when in reality they are slowly shrinking their world. Years pass, opportunities disappear, and one day they wake up wondering how life became so small. Florence Scovel Shinn understood that fear is one of the greatest forces that interrupts the natural flow of life. Fear convinces people to expect loss before loss arrives. It teaches them to rehearse disasters that have not happened. It creates imaginary suffering that feels real inside the mind. Modern psychology confirms this. The human brain evolved to protect us from danger, but in the modern world, many threats are not physical. They are emotional. Rejection, failure, embarrassment, uncertainty. And because the brain cannot always distinguish between real danger and imagined danger, we often experience stress over situations that may never occur. Some people spend decades preparing for catastrophes that never happen while completely missing the life that is happening right in front of them. Fear also creates strange contradictions. People fear loneliness, yet avoid vulnerability. They fear failure, yet refuse to try. They fear judgment, yet become prisoners of other people's opinions. They fear making mistakes, yet regret becomes the greatest mistake of all. In the end, many individuals do not suffer because they failed. They suffer because they never allowed themselves to begin. Think about how many dreams quietly disappear every year. Businesses never started. Conversations never had. Apologies never spoken. Love never expressed. Talents never developed. Not because people lacked ability, but because fear convinced them to remain where they were. Yet some of the most meaningful moments in life only exist on the other side of uncertainty. Every relationship begins with vulnerability. Every achievement begins with inexperience. Every transformation begins before confidence arrives. Confidence is rarely the starting point. More often, confidence is a reward for repeatedly facing what once frightened us. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. Courage means refusing to allow fear to make every decision. Because perhaps one of the saddest realities in life is not that people fail. It is that many people spend their entire lives negotiating with fear and slowly surrendering pieces of themselves in exchange for temporary safety. And eventually, the cost becomes greater than the risk they were trying to avoid. Perhaps the most difficult lesson people eventually learn is that life does not always move according to our schedules. We make plans, set goals, and imagine how the future should unfold. We expect hard work to produce immediate rewards. We assume that being good guarantees fair outcomes. We believe that if we make all the right decisions, suffering can somehow be avoided. But life has a way of humbling those expectations. Sometimes relationships end despite our best efforts. Sometimes opportunities disappear without explanation. Sometimes we lose people we love. Sometimes the answers we desperately want never arrive. And during those seasons, many people begin believing that life has turned against them. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that faith is not blind optimism or pretending difficulties do not exist. Faith is the ability to continue moving forward even when the entire picture is unclear. It is trusting that today's confusion does not automatically determine tomorrow's outcome. Looking back, many people discover that some of the events they once considered disasters eventually redirected them towards something better. A rejected opportunity led to a more meaningful path. A painful ending created room for healthier relationships. A season of loneliness forced them to rediscover who they were. At the time, none of it made sense. Only later did they recognize that what felt like destruction was sometimes preparation. Human beings naturally want certainty, but certainty is one of the few things life rarely provides. Instead, life asks us for trust. Trust that growth takes time. Trust that not every delay is a denial. Trust that our value does not disappear simply because circumstances become difficult. Some of the strongest individuals in history endured seasons where they could not see the outcome they hoped for. Yet they continued, not because they possessed perfect confidence, but because they refused to abandon themselves. There is something deeply peaceful about accepting that we cannot control everything. We cannot control how others behave. We cannot control the past. We cannot control every disappointment that enters our lives. But we can control whether bitterness becomes our identity. We can control whether fear becomes our master. We can control whether hardship destroys our compassion or deepens it. And perhaps that is one of the greatest rules of life. Peace does not come from controlling everything around us. Peace comes from understanding what belongs within our control and what does not. Eventually, many people discover that happiness was never hidden somewhere in the future. It was hidden inside gratitude, meaningful relationships, purpose, and the simple ability to remain hopeful even during uncertain seasons. Because in the end, life is not a battle to survive. It is a game to understand. And the better we understand the rules, the better we learn how to live. If this message resonated with you, remember that sometimes the greatest changes in life begin with a single new perspective. Nearly a century after it was first written, the ideas behind the game of life and how to play it continue to remind us that our thoughts, our choices, our fears, and our relationships shape far more than we often realize. Life may not always be easy, but perhaps it becomes lighter when we stop seeing ourselves as victims of circumstances and start seeing ourselves as active participants in our own story. Thank you for spending this time with us. This is Unchartered Decision, a channel dedicated to helping people thrive emotionally, mentally, financially, and spiritually in the modern world through cinematic storytelling and practical wisdom that stands the test of time. If you enjoy thoughtful content like this, consider subscribing and joining our growing community. And if someone you care about needs encouragement today, share this episode with them. Sometimes a single idea can change the direction of an entire life. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep moving forward, and remember, you may not control every card life deals you, but you can always learn how to play the game.